Yeah, and that really goes back to what Runaway Siren had posted in her last video about Out of Empathy. It's a really fantastic watch. I'd highly encourage people who aren't familiar with her channel to go and watch her videos. She posted very frequently. So it's an empathy suck. And we've been stuck in this cycle for a long time.
Yeah.
And now groups like ours are trying to break free from that. And we definitely appreciate the support of other LGBT people to spread the word because it matters. Your voice matters. So
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the news roundup for January 10th, 2025. We have taken a 2-week hiatus, so we have a lot of catching up to do on the news for late December and early January. First, a summary of the news. Gay and lesbian veterans reach historic settlement with the Pentagon over military discharges. A new Republican measure aims to get the Supreme Court to end same-sex marriage. The Women's March is being rebranded as the People's March. Congresswoman Nancy Mace introduces the Prison Rape Prevention Act. 2 new papers are out highlighting problems with so-called gender-affirming care. A judge in Syracuse is under investigation for refusing to officiate same-sex weddings. A teacher in Oakland sues over forced pronoun use. Meta announces it's easing censorship on its social media platforms. The Biden administration withdraws its proposed sports rules. A federal judge vacates Biden's Title IX rewrite. Texas announces lawsuits against the NCAA. And remembering lesbian radical feminist content creator Brandy Kochan, aka Runaway Siren 940, who recently passed away at age 23. And with that, I'll hand it to you, Tim.
The Pentagon has reached a settlement with over 35,000 gay and lesbian veterans discharged under discriminatory policies like Don't Ask, Don't Tell. The agreement, pending court approval, simplifies the process for removing references to sexual orientation from discharge paperwork and upgrading dishonorable discharges to honorable status. The 2023 class action lawsuit argued that the Pentagon's failure to address these records violated constitutional rights. Many veterans discharged under Don't Ask, Don't Tell have spent decades without benefits like VA loans, health care, and college tuition assistance, which all require honorable discharge status. Last year, Judge Joseph Sparrow ruled that the military's refusal to update these records was driven by, quote, discriminatory intent. The settlement streamlines a process that could previously take years, restoring dignity and privacy. It also offers expedited reviews for affected veterans. Plaintiffs, including Navy veterans Cheryl Farrell and Lily Stephanides, described the lasting impact of their discharges. Farrell said, quote, when I was discharged, I felt my service was devalued. Today, I'm proud to have stood up for recognition and dignity. End quote. While the Pentagon has taken steps to address these injustices, critics say progress has been slow. The settlement marks a significant victory for gay and lesbian veterans, addressing decades of harm caused by discriminatory policies. Meanwhile, in Idaho, a Republican lawmaker is calling for the Supreme Court to overturn Obergefell versus Hodges, the 2015 decision legalizing same-sex marriage nationwide. Representative Heather Scott introduced a draft memorial urging the court to revisit the ruling, arguing it would, quote, restore federalism by returning marriage regulation to the states. The proposal reflects a growing push from conservative lawmakers to challenge marriage equality. Supreme Court Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito have already signaled support for reconsidering Obergefell. With a 6-3 conservative majority, the court has overturned major precedents before, including abortion rights in the 2022 Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health decision. Although the memorial carries no legal weight, it signals a broader effort to strip federal protections from same-sex marriage. While Congress passed the Respect for Marriage Act in late 2022, requiring states to recognize same-sex and interracial marriages performed elsewhere, many activists fear it won't hold if Obergefell is overturned. This proposal puts marriage equality back in the crosshairs, with federal recognition once again under threat. This Idaho push to overturn Obergefell is a direct attack on gay marriage, but it's not only far-right conservatives who see opportunity in this moment. Radical trans activists often tell us, when they come for us, they'll come for you too. This indeed is the leopard eating your face moment that they've been waiting for. They may not celebrate the idea of gay marriage being lost, but they do point to the possibility as proof of their warnings, and they use it to deflect from the backlash that they fueled. But this backlash isn't happening because gay people resisted the hijacking of our movement. It's happening because we didn't resist it enough. For years, the trans radical movement has shown it doesn't care about gay people. It pathologizes gender nonconformity. It promotes medicalized conversion therapy for largely gay kids. And it rewrites our history to claim trans activists built the gay rights movement, a claim that is demonstrably false. And yet it demands we stake everything on its agenda, one that has always worked against us. Marriage equality is not a queer issue. It's a fundamental right for gay men and women in this country. The current threat to that right stems directly from the backlash fueled by this parasitic movement. If we want to protect what we've achieved, we've got to focus on advocating for ourselves, not carrying the weight of a movement that has never seen the gay rights cause as anything but a stepping stone for its own goals. Luckily, and in a time when we need a reminder, the Pentagon settlement reminds us of what's possible when we fight with clarity and purpose, progress rooted in justice and respect. It shows that when we focus on the specific needs of gay men and women, we can secure real, tangible, sustainable victories that protect our future.
Thank you, Tim. So the Women's March has been rebranded and is now called the People's March. If you all remember, the first Women's March was held in 2017 in Washington, D.C. The march was a response to the first election of Donald Trump. If you recall, during Trump's 2016 campaign, a recording from 2005 surfaced where Trump had bragged to a reporter that his celebrity status allowed him to force himself on women. After that, numerous women came forward with accusations about his past inappropriate sexual conduct. Trump dismissively called the recording, quote, locker room talk, and disputed the accusations. Well, now nearly 8 years later, the Women's March organizers say the group has evolved, absorbed past criticism, and is dedicated to including more voices as to prepare for Trump's second term. What criticisms, you may ask? Well, not including men, of course. A trans activist named Raquel Willis, who is a man, has been leading the fight to have men included in the Women's March since 2017. Willis was invited to give a speech at the 2017 Women's March and left that experience feeling his voice wasn't adequately centered. At the time, Willis was a national organizer with the Transgender Law Center. In an interview with Vice in 2018, Willis said, quote, when it comes to Black transgender women and transgender women of color, I don't want us to just be speaking at events. While we can definitely inspire the masses, I want us also to be in the room when the event is being planned. What I'm saying is, I want us to be in the leadership conversation. I want us there so there will never be a question as to whether trans women and femmes are being included. Ultimately, when we ask, are trans women being included, we are acknowledging that we, as trans women, need to be added, and the truth is we are an integral part to women-centered activism and have always been an integral part of social justice work, end quote. Well, it seems Willis and other trans activists finally got their way. And now the Women's March is the People's March, with men in leadership roles telling women what to say and how to say it. Now on to some news from Congress. Congresswoman Nancy Mace has introduced the Prison Rape Prevention Act. In December 2024, Nancy Mace introduced the Prison Rape Prevention Act, aiming to enhance the safety of female inmates by preventing the housing of male prisoners in women's facilities. Mace emphasized that incarcerating male offenders alongside female inmates increases the risk of sexual assault, stating, quote, no crime justifies housing a female inmate with men, end quote. The proposed legislation seeks to establish clear guidelines to ensure that female prisoners are not placed in environments where their safety could be compromised by the presence of male inmates. Mace criticized policies that allow biological males in women's prisons, describing them as, quote, gender-bending nonsense, end quote, that endangers women. This initiative is part of Mace's broader commitment to protecting women's rights and safety within the correctional system. She has previously advocated for measures to safeguard women's spaces and privacy, both in prisons and in society at large. Supporters argue that the act is a necessary step to protect vulnerable female inmates from potential harm. As the bill progresses through the legislative process, it is expected to prompt further debate on how best to address the complexities of gender identity within the prison system, while upholding the safety and rights of all individuals. Now to you, Ariane.
Thank you, Carol. So there are a couple of new papers out regarding transgender-related medicine. One paper from Poland finds more evidence that puberty blockers result in bone density loss. However, rather than advising against puberty blockers, the paper recommends lifestyle interventions like diet, exercise, and sunlight exposure to support bone density. In other words, they want to beat around the bush rather than address the critical issue here of the safety of puberty blockers. Another paper from BMC Medical Ethics critiques the evidence-based model for gender-affirming medical treatment, abbreviated as GAMT entirely. It focuses on 4 ways of measuring treatment outcomes. 1, doing bad, experiencing distress before GAMT. 2, moving towards a static gender identity and binary presentation. 3, doing better, overall improvement after GAMT. And 4, the absence of regret. The paper finds all of them lacking, claiming they are oriented around the idea of quote-unquote trans negativity. The fact that negative feelings persist after GAMT is offered should not, the paper argues, be used to argue against GAMT. The paper concludes by saying, quote, instead of solely focusing on substantiating the effectiveness of GAMT with empirical evidence and justifying its provision by showing overall improvement, we should explore how to better support healthcare providers and transgender individuals in navigating negative feelings throughout and post-GAMT, unquote. So then what's the alternative to evidence-based outcomes? One alternative ethical framework for justifying GAMT highlighted in the paper measures effectiveness by helping patients achieve quote-unquote embodiment goals, where, quote, healthcare is provided and justified on the basis of personal desire and autonomy, end quote. The paper claims that it is not attempting to offer a definitive answer to this question, but rather to start a conversation. In other words, the mask is off. Proponents of so-called gender-affirming medical treatments are admitting that they aren't interested in actual scientific evidence to support their claims. Rather, their arguments are philosophical, based on postmodernist queer theory jargon like embodiment goals. Of course, trying to offer physical interventions on the basis of philosophy rather than scientific evidence radically alters the very paradigm upon which modern medicine is built. What's next in this brave new world? And now moving on to another story regarding same-sex marriage. In December of 2024, Syracuse.com reported that a Syracuse City Court judge, Felicia Pitts Davis, is under investigation for refusing to marry a same-sex couple the month prior. Court spokesperson Al Baker said that judges are allowed to, but not required to, perform marriages. However, when they do perform marriages, they are not allowed to discriminate against particular couples to marry. So what Pitts Davis did wrong, according to the law, is she took on the job that she could have optionally to preside over marriages, but she only married opposite-sex couples and refused to marry same-sex couples. So while she is under investigation for this discrimination, Pitts-Davis will only handle civil and not criminal cases at her own request. This is not the first time that something like this has happened. In 2015, Kentucky County Clerk Kim Davis made the news when she defied a federal order to issue marriages to same-sex couples. Davis spent a brief time in jail for contempt of court. Meanwhile, her deputy clerks began issuing same-sex marriage licenses, and the licenses were ultimately modified to remove Kim Davis's name. Kim Davis would go on to lose re-election in 2018. Pitts-Davis' case in Syracuse is comparatively minor in that her participation is not required to authorize same-sex marriages in her county. Another judge can, and in fact did, perform same-sex marriages in her place. It's also the case that it would have been fairly easy for Pitts-Davis to have never done same-sex marriages if she just declined to do any marriage ceremonies entirely. It was her choice to take on the role of officiating weddings or officiating marriages and not doing it for same-sex couples. However, this whole story is emblematic of the continuing resistance to same-sex marriage and the larger issue of how to balance personal religious beliefs with the rights of same-sex couples. Now, moving on to the other side of the country, in Oakland, California. A school teacher in Oakland, California, named Mirella Ramirez, has filed a lawsuit against the Oakland Unified School District for allegedly firing her for refusing to use male pronouns for her trans-identified female kindergarten student. In her complaint, Ramirez claims that forcing her to use the student's preferred pronouns violates her Catholic religious beliefs. The complaint further states that being a teacher in a dual English-Spanish immersive bilingual class made Ramirez's predicament even more difficult, as Spanish has grammatical gender, making it hard to form gender-neutral sentences. Despite this, Ramirez was denied accommodation, including assistance on how to formulate gender-neutral sentences in Spanish. She was also refused permission to teach in another classroom, even ones without trans-identifying students present. Instead, she had her pay terminated while under suspension. Ramirez's defense team cites freedom of speech and freedom of religion. We the Patriots USA, as well as Harmit Dillon's Dillon Law Group, are assisting Ramirez in the lawsuit. And by the way, Dillon is the lawyer for the prominent detransitioner Chloe Cole, who is suing Kaiser and has recently been tapped by the Trump administration to be Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. So Harmeet Dillon is very big in this whole trans fight. Now, I find it incredible that kids as young as kindergarten now have state-enforced gender identities. That's absurd. And of course, I support Ramirez in her lawsuit. Freedom of speech and religion are important. That said, I hope that courts don't conclude that teachers only have a right to abstain from preferred pronouns if they claim a traditional religion. You can be an atheist and also find that preferred pronouns are against your own belief in biological reality. So I hope that not only does Ramirez win her lawsuit, but that the rights to not be subject to compelled speech in regards to gender identity are also extended to people without formal religious affiliation. And speaking of compelled speech, on Tuesday, January 7th, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg announced plans to ease censorship on Meta platforms, including Facebook and Instagram. This plan involves ending cooperation with professional fact-checking organizations. Instead, they plan on employing the community notes model currently used by X, formerly known as Twitter, where users themselves contribute to the fact-checking. Not everyone is happy about this move, including LGBTQ+ groups that have informed these fact-checkers. GLAAD, for example, took to Instagram to complain, saying these changes will enable anti-LGBTQ hate speech. But we think this is a step in the right direction, as too often professional fact checkers are heavy-handed in enforcing particular narratives. And that includes things like flagging people for hate speech if they use sex-based pronouns or just plain disagree with their political rhetoric. For example, we complained on X before when GLAAD tried getting Gays Against Groomers' Facebook account removed. We support free speech, including for people we agree with and with people we disagree with. We hope Zuckerberg's announcement marks a new positive chapter in the mission to foster a free speech-friendly environment on social media. And with that, I'm handing it to you, Joss.
Thanks, Ariane. The Biden administration has withdrawn its proposed rule that aimed to prohibit schools from banning trans-identified athletes from participating on sports teams aligning with their gender identity. This decision, announced on December 20th, 2024, was influenced by over 150,000 public comments and ongoing legal challenges. The proposed regulation, introduced in April 2023, sought to amend Title IX to prevent categorical bans on trans-identifying athletes while allowing certain restrictions to ensure fairness and competition. However, it faced significant opposition, particularly from Republican-led states, and became a focal point in the national debate over trans rights in sports. The Department of Education cited multiple pending lawsuits and the extensive public feedback as reasons for not proceeding with the regulation at this time. This move comes as the administration prepares for a transition of power, with the incoming Trump administration expected to implement policies that may further restrict trans participation in sports. Advocates for transgender rights have expressed disappointment over the withdrawal, viewing it as a setback for inclusivity and protection against discrimination. Conversely, opponents argue that such regulations could undermine fairness in women's and girls' sports. The issues remain highly contentious, with ongoing legal battles and legislative efforts at both the federal and state levels. In fact, as we were preparing copy for today's episode, we got breaking news that a federal judge ruled that the Biden administration's overhaul of Title IX was unlawful. Chief Judge Danny Reeves of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Kentucky, a George W. Bush appointee, wrote in his opinion that the Biden regulations suffer, quote, significant constitutional infirmities, end quote. For example, using the wrong pronouns for a student could be considered harassment under the rule, and the judge noted that the provisions, quote, offends the First Amendment, end quote. Over the summer and fall, we reported that the Title IX changes were on hold in 26 states due to a series of lawsuits initiated by Republican attorneys general of those states. Thursday's order was the first final ruling in those cases and was part of a lawsuit brought by Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia last April. In their lawsuit, those states asserted that Biden's rule changes would punish them for state laws that restrict transgender student participation in women's sports, hinder the First Amendment rights of students and staff, and bar schools from enforcing their policies to protect student privacy. In Judge Reeves' 15-page opinion, he stated that the Education Department under the Biden administration exceeded its authority when it issued a regulation that conflicts with the plain language of Title IX. With the Biden administration soon coming to a close and Trump's position on trans-identifying athletes, as we mentioned just moments ago, it is unlikely the incoming Trump administration will fight to uphold Biden's Title IX changes in court. And in related news, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton sued the NCAA in late December, accusing the organization of engaging in, quote, false, deceptive, and misleading practices, end quote, by allowing trans-identified males to participate in athletic events marketed as women's competitions. The NCAA oversees college sports at more than 1,000 colleges and universities nationwide, and Paxton said duping women's sports fans is a violation of Texas's Deceptive Trade Practices Act, a state law that shields consumers against businesses that falsely advertise their products. Paxton said the NCAA is also jeopardizing the safety and well-being of women by permitting trans-identified males to compete against women. Paxton is requesting the court grant a permanent injunction prohibiting the NCAA from allowing trans-identified males to compete in women's sporting events that take place in Texas or that involve Texas schools. Alternatively, he said, the court could order the NCAA to market its women's events as co-ed. In 2022, the NCAA adopted a sport-by-sport approach to transgender participation where eligibility depends on rules set by a sport's national or international governing body. The organization is facing a separate legal challenge over its transgender policy from current and former college athletes who said the NCAA violated their Title IX rights when it allowed Leah Thomas, a trans-identified male, to compete in its national championships in 2022 and subsequently win an NCAA Division I title. And finally, in a very sad bit of news, we are heartbroken to learn that runaway siren 940 has passed away. For those not acquainted with her work, she was a fiercely outspoken radical feminist lesbian. She published hundreds of videos on YouTube, and over the last 3.5 years, her content was decidedly critical of gender ideology. Her body of work focused primarily on the Gen Z lesbian experience, with the aim of empowering young women, particularly lesbians, to fight back against gender ideology. Her videos often depicted a day in her life with voiceover commentary about her chosen topic. In the last video she published before her passing, called Out of Empathy, she worked on a painting while her voiceover described how inescapable trans activism has become and how trans activism has sucked all the empathy out of the world, for lack of a better way to describe it. I highly recommend you see for yourself. Her channel will be linked in our comment on this video, and I'll include a clip from Out of Empathy here.
Empathy is necessary. It's an admirable trait. But at a certain point, are we not allowed to just be tired? Tired of saying the same basic arguments. Tired of defining woman. Tired of arguing points that we all know to be true. Tired of pointing out misogyny, homophobia, and sexism and being told that it's our fault for noticing it. Tired of endless compassion for people who ultimately choose to go down this path and perpetuate the cycle to others by lying, bullying, and profiting off of gender identity. This, dear viewers, is where we part.
We talked about a lot of different topics today, ladies. I'm curious about your thoughts on a number of them. In particular, what do you think about the issue with the judge in Syracuse?
I think she should have already known the rules that were in place. Like, you know, if it's legal for same-sex couples to get married, then obviously she's going to probably have to do some of those ceremonies. And if that was against her religion, then why did she even elect to go and perform the ceremonies? Like, that's my first question. Was it mandated of her? It's not mandated of her. So how is she claiming that there's any kind of violation of her rights? I mean, she didn't have to step into it.
Yeah, I mean that's how I feel. And one analogy I can think of for this, flipping it the politics the other way around, what if you live in some county or something that allows concealed carry and you have a role in the government where you are supposed to issue concealed carry permits and you refuse to do so because you morally are against guns. Well, sorry, that doesn't fly. Like that's a job that you had to do. And I feel like in the case of this woman, she took on a job, namely, well, first of all, by being judged, but also taking on the role of issuing marriage certificates. And it was a role she couldn't fulfill, and she should have known in advance.
Yeah, those are fair points. My grandmother used to say something like, something about not selling, don't hire out if you don't want to work. Like, she had the option to not go that route, but it seems like maybe she was trying to make kind of a fuss, maybe get some attention. I don't know if this is an attention ploy or what, but are we really concerned about the potential for lesbians and gay people to get married in the coming years? Is this something that we're really concerned could be a problem?
I would say for me, it's a little bit of a concern, not a huge one, but there's still a problem here because the constitutional right to same-sex marriage does require, it does hinge on a Supreme Court decision, and it's a Supreme Court could change their mind if there was a challenge to it. Some people have, used the example of Dobbs overturning Roe versus Wade as an example of how the conservative Supreme Court currently could very well overturn the precedent with gay marriage. That said, I'm a little I have my doubts that the Supreme Court will do that. If you actually read the Dobbs decision about abortion, it's written in such a way to explicitly say that this doesn't apply, that this doesn't affect things like gay marriage and I think interracial marriage as well. Now, Clarence Thomas did issue a concurrence with that, saying that actually he does want the ruling on same-sex marriage overturned, but that was just his minority concurrence. So I'm not convinced that the current justices like Gorsuch or Kavanaugh, for that matter, are going to really be, or Roberts even, are going to really be in the mood for doing that. But it's always a possibility. So
I see a lot of folks, especially on the left or I guess media. I see left media, especially like the LGBTQ big orgs, really clutch their pearls and scream about this like it's coming, you know. And I think that's a little overly dramatic, but I do think that we do have to stay aware and we do have to watch legislation. We do have to watch what's going on because, you know, as we've seen with women's rights, stuff can turn real quick before, I mean, things you thought would never happen can turn around and happen again. So you do have to stay vigilant, but I think you have to be logical with your vigilance and not get carried away in fear. And that, I think that's what I look for. I hope, I don't, personally, I don't think this is a battle they want to get into again. They lost the last one. Why are they going to throw this out of all the things? I mean, honestly, there's so much easy pickings. If you want to go after the left, why fight this one? Especially because, you know, in the last 20 years, especially, there's been a lot of movement, even on the right, to be accepting of gay folks and of gay marriage. You know, I've just seen it in my community change. So, and my community is largely conservative and Republican. So I don't think the fight's there, but I could be wrong.
yeah, and like you're saying, there are a lot of issues they could go after the left on, including the whole gender ideology thing, which is way less popular for the left.
Of course, the risk there, and this is why we exist, right? And try to speak out as much as possible. The risk is that that lesbians, gays, and bisexuals are tied in to the T and the Q. That's the problem. That's the risk. And that's why we have to be so careful to break that apart, break same-sex attracted people apart from the trans identity and the queer identity label that encompasses everybody.
Exactly. If we're lumped in with the whole TQ plus thing, then whatever targets the TQ plus thing also targets us.
Yeah, it's getting thrown under the bus with them. And you're like, no, different situation here.
And I think and honestly, that's what a lot of LGBTQ plus groups also want. They want to lump in the popular issues with the unpopular issues, still, you know, in order to confuse people and go like,
that's how they did it in the first place.
Yeah, this is how we're targeting LGBTQ plus people. So you don't really know, like, oh no, this could be like someone who's really horribly homophobic. And then you look at the details of what's going on and it has nothing to do with gay anything. It's about trans identities or something.
A perfect example of this is Nancy Mace, right? She has been just all over the LGBTQ plus media and stuff, and those super left media has been called, you know, this horrible bigot, right? And they've even thrown in homophobia. But if you look at her record of factual voting, she's for same-sex marriage. She is for protecting homosexuals under the law. Her issue is with the trans stuff. She's broken it apart, but they don't want to talk about that. They don't want to recognize that. So, you know, I'm glad she's done it. She is a Republican, but regardless of that, her voting record shows that she is for same-sex marriage and same-sex rights.
Yeah, I think you make the excellent point and tie-in about being used as shields. And that was in all the reporting I was looking at about Title IX and those changes. extremely liberal writings on this. We're definitely tying and using LGB as a shield and making this about sexual orientation, where it's really about protecting women's sports and about making a clear delineation and protecting women's bodies in sports. It wasn't about sexuality in that sense. And of course, our stance as a group was about protecting our ability to have single sex spaces as LGBT people, for gay men and lesbians to be able to group on college campuses in single sex spaces. So those things are definitely at odds.
You know, it's important to point out that in just my normal conversations with people in person in my community, anytime LGBTQ is brought up, the person automatically associates that with gay people. They think gay people first. And I think that's interesting because that means that most people are thinking of us when they're thinking of bigotry against LGBTQ. They're not thinking of the whole trans issue, which is really the big issue here.
Yes, I've noticed that too. And I've noticed the tendency of a lot of, fairly well-meaning people, otherwise well-meaning people who just sort of use this label LGBTQ plus because that's what's sort of the trendy thing to do now. And they do that. And I read the context. I'm pretty sure they based on their intentions, they really are talking about gays and gay rights sort of things, but it's just like become so popularized in our jargon to lump all that together that now they're just using it, not realizing that LGBTQ plus, the people who really popularized that term are people who are really trying to get the focus on the TQ plus, not the gay thing.
Well, and that ties back to the reporting on Meta and what Ben Ryan had written also about it very much echoes what we have said in long ago reporting about GLAAD and HRC and the GLAAD media guide in particular, that change of language and who was consulted. The gay community was not consulted about the change of language. They just made themselves the arbiter of these long held terms and flipping them on their head. And it's really to advance a cause that undermines the homosexual and bisexual experience. So it's pernicious, certainly, but there's definitely a lot of through line of these various stories, and they come back to unfortunately, because of scheduling conflicts, Tim always pre-records. So, but Tim also speaks to in his segment about the backlash of all of this regarding marriage, and it really being because we didn't come out soon enough and hard enough as LGBT people to distance ourselves from the crazy of the TQIA. And he really makes an excellent point in that.
And I just want to point out here that, lesbian, gays, and bisexuals, we're not any different than anybody else in society, right? We have empathy. We're gonna believe stories. I would say actually we were targeted much earlier than heterosexual folks on forming this empathy towards the trans individuals, right? As the most suffered, most hard, hard to live folks and the most bigoted against, just most discriminated, like that kind of stuff. So we were already primed many years before mainstream to be empathetic towards this group of people. And so, yes, a lot of us fell for it. And a lot of us still do believe that we have to protect these vulnerable people. It's empathy. They've hijacked people's empathy. And that's why I always say it's great to be nice, but it's better to be logical and truthful, because ultimately that's where you treat everybody with dignity and respect.
Yeah, and that really goes back to what Runaway Siren had posted in her last video about Out of Empathy. It's a really fantastic watch. I highly encourage people who aren't familiar with her channel to go and watch her videos. She posted very frequently. So it's an empathy suck. And we've been stuck in this cycle for a long time. And now groups like ours are trying to break free from that. And we definitely appreciate the support of other LGBT people to spread the word, because it matters. Your voice matters. So.
And I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you, everyone, for watching, and we hope to see you again next week. Remember to like and subscribe.